1,208 proposed new laws. So I'm not sure we need that many new laws. I'm sure we don't. Only 370 passed, which is good. It's down, or actually it's up a little bit that were sent to the governor. He signed 347 of those bills. He vetoed 23 bills, but that's really a false number because toward the end of the session, he hadn't gotten the budget. He was getting a little irritated that they hadn't passed a budget. So one day they set up 10 bills and he vetoed all 10 bills with a one-line veto letter that said, I'm not signing any bills until you send me a budget. So he vetoed all 10 of those bills, not having to do it at all with the bills. But the legislature knew that that's why he did it, so they went back and passed all 10 of those, sent him back up, and he signed them. So this really is only 13 vetoes instead of 23 vetoes. The league tracked more than 200 bills, more than 200 that had something to do directly with cities and towns. So a lot of the bills introduced into the legislature at the state level really don't have much to do with state business, but they have a lot to do with our local business in cities and towns. We had one legislator at the beginning of the session who said, well, this is going to really be a rough year for cities. And he was kind of gleeful about it. And we said, well, every year is a rough year. And he said, yeah, but this is going to be especially rough. So there's something in the water that once they get to the capital down in Phoenix, they sort of want to get involved in cities. So I encourage you all, when you're talking to candidates, to say, when you're elected to the legislature, I want you to focus on state legislation and leave the cities alone, or if there are bills that have to do with cities, check back with us and say, is this good for our city or not? Rather than go to the legislature and just work for special interest groups or pass special interest legislation that hurts cities. That they should be working for us. There's one other thing that happened I didn't put on this this slide. It's even hard to believe that it happened this session. It seems like it was so long ago, but the beginning of the session, the whole legislature for like 2 weeks was focused on nothing on legislation. They were all focused on sexual harassment and the investigations and all that stuff going on. You remember that? And that was just the beginning of this year, and they actually ended up voting to expel Representative Don Shooter from Yuma for violating House rules relating to that. But, you know, there's always a second act in politics, and he's gotten signatures, and he's on the ballot now to run for the Senate to come back again. So, you know, just because you've been thrown out doesn't mean that you're going to stay out. Hi, Mayor.
Hi. Good afternoon. I didn't know you guys were already started. Yeah. Somebody's got to fix that clock in my room and help out.
No, we're just getting underway here.
I'll be sitting right there with my ears open and learning about all the things. Thank you for coming over so much.
You bet.
I'm here to introduce you and welcome you. This is your home away from home.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I always feel welcome here. All right, the focus of the league this year, as it is every year, is on, well, let me talk about the major legislative issues. Teacher pays, you know, was the biggest issue, but what's also surprising about that issue is it didn't even come up until almost just the last couple of weeks of the session. There was talk about teacher pay, but the governor put in his budget 1% raise for teachers, and that seemed to be the general agreed on figure until the Red for Ed movement came along. Man, I'll tell you, they had people everywhere. They were in our parking lot. They were all over the Capitol grounds. They were in the committee rooms. They were in the galleries of the House and the Senate. And it was just amazing what a big impact they had. And so you could really see the governor was kind of going, wow, what am I going to do here? Because he said 1%. I always think that he was probably up in his office one day and he probably said to himself, did I say 1%? I meant 20% on a teacher raise. So he suddenly said, we're going to readjust the budget and do 20% raise. There's some question about how sustainable that is, if there really is money to pay that in the future. So we'll see. But that really was the big issue at the end of the day.
But did they agree on 20% or 10%?
No, they agreed on 20% by 2020. It's sort of a step-up process. But again, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to get the money in the future? So that's the big challenge. There was another focus, digital goods. I'll talk about that because that was a very important bill for all of us in this room. VLT and HERF, we always talk about that. There's actually some good news on that this year. Opioids I mentioned, And school safety, that's another issue that happened right at the beginning of the session. There was the Parkland shooting, remember, down in Florida? So they said, oh, we're going to do something about school safety. Introduced a bunch of bills. You know, the gun lobby didn't like some of those bills, and the teacher advocates didn't like others. And so they spent a lot of time talking about it, but at the end of the day, they passed absolutely nothing on school safety. Nothing was done. With the League focus, we always focus on these top two issues, local control and protection of shared revenue. We read all the bills that are introduced and we test them on, does this infringe on local control, local decision making, and does it impact the shared revenue system? We also try to have lots of data available so that when we go and lobby at the legislature that we have information and facts, because we don't make political contributions, so we can't influence people with money. We have to influence them with information. We do a lot of pre-session work. We focus on the resolutions that are passed at the League conference, and we look at any additional bills that may come along that impact cities. So let me start off with the budget and the HERF funds. There were several bills in the budget that had to do with HERF this year, and this was interesting because for a number of years we've been trying to figure out how can we get more money into HERF and to stop those HERF sweeps. So what we did this last year was we talked to a couple of legislators, one in the House, one in the Senate, and said, what if we imposed a new vehicle safety fee? We had the director of ADOT just adopt a fee, then it wouldn't be a tax, so you wouldn't have to vote on a tax increase, but that fee could then be dedicated to DPS funding, and that would eliminate the need to sweep HERF because then DPS would have a dedicated funding source. How about that? So they said, it's a good idea. So they drafted those bills. They didn't go anywhere. They were just kind of sitting there languishing and nothing happening with them until the teacher Red for Ed movement came along. And then all of a sudden people said, hey, there's a way we can get some money. So all of a sudden the bill in the Senate was revived, it got to the floor, it passed, and like that it was signed into law to increase, have a fee set by the director of ADOT to have a dedicated funding for DPS. Well, except that instead of all of it going to HERF, they said, well, now we can use the leftover money from the regular state budget to pay for the part of the teacher increase. So it was like our idea was accepted, but we didn't get all of the result that we wanted. But the good news is they did reduce the HERF sweep substantially this year, and so you all should be seeing an increase in HERF funds. And they also did a one-time appropriation of $30 million for HERF, with $14 million of that going to cities and towns. So the trend is good in that the HERF sweeps are definitely down, and we're seeing more money coming through that formula for cities and towns. So that was good news, and we were glad that they did that and used at least some of that money for this new safety fee for offsetting DPS or offsetting HERF sweeps. The bad news is when you go to renew your car, it's going to be another $18 on top of the fee, but that will be dedicated to DPS. All right, some other budget items that impact cities. There was a bill that added money to the state aviation fund for the first time in 10 years. Ever since the recession came along, this is one of the funds that has been zeroed out year after year. But fortunately, the legislature did appropriate almost $19 million to the state aviation fund, part of that for municipal airports. So you can contact the state aviation board and see if they have some. You can do a grant or a grant application if you have a project that needs some funds for your local airport. Senate Bill 1523 allows the Concealed Weapons Permit Fund to be used for police officer training through AZ Post. And then we are unfortunately continuing to be assessed almost $21 million to pay for the operations of the State Department of Revenue. So they're collecting our taxes, you know, the TPT taxes, and they're doing the shared revenue distributions, but we're paying for that privilege for them to do that for us. Between cities, towns, counties, and 2 COGs, we're paying almost $21 million directly back to run that state agency. This next issue was one that was huge. It was digital goods and services. Now, there was a task force that was created last interim to look at the taxation of digital goods and services. Now, you all know that we've just had the Wayfair decision through the U.S. Supreme Court that said online transactions can be taxed, can be charged sales tax without the physical nexus test. That means that you don't have to have a physical location of the vendor in your state in order to have the ability to tax online transactions. But well, interestingly enough, Arizona has been taxing, and we cities, through the Model City Tax Code, we have been taxing online transactions ever since the 90s. Because in our state law, it says that we can tax anything that is either a transaction involving tangible items or something that's measurable. And when you're doing an online transaction, it's the same as making a retail purchase. But this interim committee met a lot of times and talked about, well, you know, what are we going to do with digital services going into the future? And then they issued a statement at the end of the committee that said we're going to have a bill that simply codifies the practices that we're doing now on digital transactions, and it'll be revenue neutral. Well, they introduced the bill, and we looked at it at the league and said, wait a minute, this isn't revenue neutral. This introduces 8 new exemptions, and it's going to be extremely costly, not only this year, but especially going into the future as more and more things are happening online and through digital transactions. So it was really flying through the legislative process, and at one point it had already passed the House, ready to pass the Senate, and we said, what's the fiscal impact? We asked one senator to request a fiscal impact, and they went to the state agencies that issued those reports, and they said, we can't tell you, we don't know, because we're just unable to calculate it. Well, we said that's not acceptable. So we got our own numbers, did our own analysis, and we came up with a $160 million impact to the state, cities, and to schools. And we were challenged on that. We had the people who were supporting this bill say, well, your numbers are wrong. And we said, well, if our numbers are wrong, where are your numbers? Well, we don't have any numbers. So our numbers became the default factual numbers, thank goodness, and it slowed this bill down. What they were trying to do was to change the, like I said, the definition of services in such a way as this. If you rent a movie, if you go to a physical Blockbuster, if you could find one, and rent a movie on DVD, they charge a sales tax, right? Because you're renting a movie. Or if you go online to like Amazon or one of those services and you download a movie, then you're charged. But the committee said in this bill, they said, but if you just watch a movie, if you just stream it, even if it's on demand, then there's no tax on that. That's free. But we said, but it's the same transaction. You're not just watching TV. You're actually renting something on an on-demand basis, and it's the same as what we have in our Model City Tax Code, tangible personal properties, what you're watching or renting, and so we said it should be a taxable transaction. He said, no, we didn't want it to be taxable. The same with software. They said if you buy TurboTax, then you're taxed, or if you download TurboTax, then there's a tax on it. But if you use it online and prepare your tax return, then it's free, no tax. We said those should all be exactly the same transaction. So finally, toward the end of the session, we drafted our own bill and took it to a couple of senators and said, this bill does exactly what the committee said they wanted. It continues the transactions just the way we're doing them now, the way DOR is doing it, the way cities are doing it, and it is revenue neutral. And so they tried to move that bill forward, but again, the people who wanted the original bill didn't like our version, and so at the end of the day, nothing passed. But because of the Wayfair decision that just came out of the U.S. Supreme Court, we will have to create some sort of a economic threshold for Arizona to decide when it is we're going to start taxing transactions on the internet. Because the Supreme Court said physical nexus is no longer a valid standard, but you can have economic nexus, either by the number of transactions or a dollar amount. You know, once you hit a certain threshold, then you have to start paying. So we'll need to do that, and we'll need to make sure that whatever is offered next year doesn't have these bad features of the digital goods bill that happened this last session. Okay. Any questions with that? But this was one where your league dues really paid off, because we were able to stop this bill that would have been costly not only today but forever, because the way, you know, the Prop 105 works is or Prop 108 is if they ever reduce, eliminate a tax on something, it can never be put back on without a 2/3 vote of both chambers, and that would never happen. So, we were able to prevent that from happening this year. All right, moving on, prime contracting. We've been talking about this issue for years and how to tax prime contracting. And what's happened is that over the years, since the reform of taxing on construction sales tax, we've seen basically collections go down because of the formula from MURA, the remodel, restoration, alteration, all those definitions. They were very confusing. And so finally the industry, the construction industry, said, we have an idea. They brought forward this bill. It wasn't the league bill, it wasn't the government bill this time, it was the contracting industry. And we thought it was a pretty good bill. So they have some new definitions in there for especially people like handymen, and limits on what's alteration and so forth. So it makes a real clear line about when you pay just retail tax on materials or when you do construction sales tax and pay a percentage of the total value of the project. So it's very detailed, and I encourage you, if you're interested, to take a look at it. But we think that this over time will really clarify the line that should be drawn between these different kinds of taxing on construction. We had a big fight this year over this bill. There were two of them, again, one in the House, one in the Senate, and then they both died, and then they were resurrected as the Senate, as the legislative process does, by strikers and all that. But this one would have really changed the way that we do local zoning, because it would have said that people have an absolute right to operate a business out of their home, even if it's in a residential area. And this, usually, like a lot of legislation, came from one issue, one person, one place that said, oh, the city wouldn't let me run my business. And it wasn't the city, really. What it was her neighbors were complaining about all the traffic and all the noise and all the activity at this house in a residential area. And she said, their neighbors said, you're running a business out of your house, and we don't want you to do that. You should go to a commercial area. She said, well, I want to run it out of my house. And so Goldwater Institute got involved in this and said, no, everybody has a right to run businesses out of their home. And they said, we're trying to stop the next Apple Computers from being founded because it was started in a garage. And we said, no, we're not trying to mess with anybody's home-based business. There are thousands of home-based businesses that are going all over the place that aren't bothering anybody, but when they do get to the point of bothering their neighbors, the neighbors have as much property right to peace and quiet in their neighborhood as the other person has to operate a business. So again, this went back and forth, and it ended up passing the House, but it didn't pass in the Senate. But we've already seen there's all kinds of communications going out about this issue, and we know it'll be back next year. Oh, the other thing about this is, since the passage of Senate Bill 1487, we've seen more and more claims filed, and we knew that if this bill passed and somebody didn't have or was operating a business and the city said you can't do that, and this bill said you have an absolute right to do that, we knew we'd get more 1487 complaints, and that's like the death penalty, because as Dave, as you know, if you don't comply with 1487, then you could lose your shared revenue. Well, nobody can afford to lose shared revenue, and so that was another reason why we opposed this bill. All right, food trucks. There's a big issue of food trucks, especially in the valley, because different cities had different regulations about them. And so this bill was introduced that said food trucks can operate pretty much 24/7 anywhere they want, anytime they want. We were able to modify this bill and get it so that we do have some control over where they can locate and how long they can be at a single parking space or a parking meter, and that they can't just park right in front of a brick and mortar restaurant. So we were able to make a compromise on this bill, and this one was signed into law and will go into effect on August 3rd. Occupational licensing. It's at the city level, we don't do a lot of occupational licensing, but there were two bills that were really problematic this session. The first one said we could never ever do any occupational licensing in the future if we ever wanted to. That one did not pass. And the second one said we ended up negotiating on this one to say if you have any occupational licenses now in your city code, you have to revisit those at least once every 5 years. You have to put them on a council agenda and decide if you want to continue them or not. and then it's like a sunset provision. And then if you want to have a new occupational license for any kind of, you know, door-to-door peddlers or something like that, then you have to, again, hold a public hearing, have it come before the council, and then it has to be also renewed every 5 years. So it's like a, just to make sure that you want to continue these occupational regulations if you have them in your town code.
Ken, was that the one where the governor got involved with a person that wanted to cut somebody's hair?
No, that's related, but that had to do with a state occupational licensing at the state level, because we don't get into that. It's the same philosophy, but that was a state agency, the hairdressers or whatever, and the toenail clippers and those kinds of things. Yeah, but those were all state licenses he was talking about.
Thank you.
All right, this bill unfortunately passed. We kind of consider this a loss because what it does is it fundamentally changes the way that you all do cable TV licensing. It voids all of your existing cable TV licenses as of January 1st, 2020, and it says that after the January 1st of 2019, you have to adopt a new format for cable licenses, and when a cable operator comes to town, all they have to do is fill out the form and turn it in, and it's automatically granted. There is no, the city has no say in whether it is or isn't approved. It was really, this was an effort to try to basically void all local cable licenses. And the original version of this bill said there would be one statewide license that would go to the Secretary of State's office, and the Secretary of State would manage all cable in the whole state. We ended up getting it so that they do have to come to the city, but again, unfortunately, we don't have any ability to either negotiate on the requirements. We can't ask them for anything. We can't say you have to provide cable service to the city or to the schools or to the community center or anything. They just turn in the license and it's automatically granted. One of the things that was in the original bill was that we would no longer have control over street cuts or use of the right-of-way. Fortunately, we were able to get that put back into the bill, so we still have our control over right-of-way access and street cuts and those kinds of things, but we can't require any other extractions from a cable company when they submit a license or want to do business in our communities. They will continue the licensing fee up to a maximum of 5% of gross revenues, but the rest of the provisions that are in place now in your local license will be going away once this bill goes into effect.
Why is it, Ken, that the state legislature is always saying to the federal government, we want to have local control, and they get upset when the federal government has an overreach? That's none of their business. And they do the same thing that they criticize to local cities and counties. And this is one that I followed. Wasn't this the one that the originator was Cox Communication?
Yes, yes. It was.
And I followed this one with it because I thought this would really hurt Nogales.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm glad you got that right-of-ways taken care of, because that's a big thing. Because we have some leverage with the right-of-ways. But this was, I mean, yeah, they can just tell us now, go to hell, unless we have some control over their right-of-ways and access.
Right, but yeah, as far as quality of service or build-out or any of that kind of stuff, we've lost all the ability to work with them on those kinds of issues. So yeah, it was a big loss, and you're right, we're always frustrated by that sort of duplicitous, we don't like it when somebody tells us what to do, but we want to tell you what to do. It's kind of, it's one of those things that happens year after year. We fight it, we oppose it, but that's where we need you all to be weighing in with your legislators. And I think your folks have been pretty good with this, but there are a lot of other people that aren't.
Well, they've been good, but there's 3 Democrats and they don't carry any water.
That's the unfortunate thing, is it all comes down to who's got the majority.
That's right.
Yeah.
But we can still charge, like you said, up to 5%.
Yes.
Right, because I think the city of Nogales charges 2%, right?
Yeah, and I don't know how you would adjust that. So that's something that your city attorney will have to look into, is exactly how to administer that going forward. I checked on that today because I had had that question elsewhere, as people said, what's the rate? And so I looked in the bill. The bill actually says that it's up to no higher than 5%. So that's because that's the federal level. So you might want to have somebody check into that for the next contract.
So this eliminates any franchise fees or anything like that?
Yeah. Yep.
Now, have they noticed that maybe more cable companies would come into smaller communities or not?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because when Cox introduced this, they said, well, what we want is to have more competition. We want to have more cable companies. And we thought, well, that doesn't make sense. You don't really want more competition. But this will allow, if there happens to be somebody that wants to come into a market, this will allow them to just simply show up, file the application, and be granted the ability to provide service. And because of the build-out restrictions, they don't have to serve the entire city. They could just serve a neighborhood or a certain area. So potentially there might be somebody that comes in and gets into the cable business. I think, frankly, though, the real reason that they did this is because cable with coax is a dying industry. More and more people are using online, using streaming, using satellite, using other means of using your phone, and tossing to your TV set and things like that. So I think that this is a way that they thought they could maybe preserve at least a little of their business model going forward. All right, Senate Bill 1487. I briefly mentioned this, and what an offensive, bad bill this was. That any legislator can just file a complaint against any city, and it really puts you in the death grip of potentially losing your shared revenue. So we came up with some ideas for reform. We wanted it to be repealed, but there was no appetite in the legislature to repeal it. But we said, well, let's give both the AG and cities more time to respond, because this 30-day window is ridiculously short. And also, one of the most important things, two of the next most important things, is we want access to the courts the same way the AG has access, because under 1487, if the AG says that it does violate, then we have no opportunity to go to the Supreme Court. We have to start at the Superior Court, and you can't afford 6 months of shared revenue as a bond and then to lose it while you're going through the court system. And then we also said a legislator should at least have the community that they're complaining about in their legislative district. That only seems fair. And unfortunately, this bill and the next bill that the AG asked for didn't go anywhere. It was an utter failure. And in fact, some members of the legislature said, well, we want to expand 1487 to have it apply to any city employee, so we can make a complaint about any city employee doing anything. We said, no. We would rather have nothing than expand it. And now we have a brand new 1487 complaint just filed this week against the city of Sedona. Somebody complaining that their room tax and their support for the local Chamber of Commerce is a violation of the gift clause in the Constitution. So that's now a 1487 complaint, which is, again, it's the way we do business everywhere. That's part of our economic development. I think this is either the 9th or the 10th one that has been filed, and all but one have been filed by legislators that do not have the city they're complaining about in their own district.
Ken, I was going to ask you on that one. Is is it going to go through the court system, or?
Well, the city attorney in Sedona has prepared a response already. This just came out last week, late last week, and so he's already prepared a response. He's been in communication with the AG, so we'll see where it goes. If the AG finds that it does not violate state law, then it just dies. But
will that set a precedent for all the other communities?
Well, it wouldn't really set a precedent, because it's just, well, in a way it would.
It makes it easier to defeat it in the future. In case
but again, what you're doing is you're putting all of the, basically all of the weight of the court system, of the legal system, all on one person, the Attorney General. The Attorney General is the judge, jury, and executioner, because if that Attorney General says, yes, it violates law, we have no ability to appeal that. We have to just either knuckle under or have them find, no, it doesn't violate state law. Those are the only, really, the two things that happen under 1487.
And we won't know until he decides.
We won't know until he decides. He's supposed to decide within 30 days, but we'll see.
Keep us posted.
Yeah, we definitely will.
Yeah.
All right, PTSD counseling. Our police folks will be interested in this. A couple of years ago, we had a bill that mandated that cities had to provide up to 12 visits to first responders if they felt like they had been exposed to something that created PTSD as a result of their work activities. And so the firefighters came back and said that's not enough, and the qualifications for these counselors isn't good enough. We need more visits. And so they introduced this bill, which was really very, very broad when it was first introduced. In fact, we sent it off to a national expert, and he said this is the most sweeping bill on PTSD I've seen in the whole United States. And it basically said that a person could sort of self-diagnose PTSD, be off for up to a year with full pay and benefits, just basically until they felt like they wanted to self-diagnose and come back to work. And so we said that's not fair to the taxpayer. We want to take care of our first responders, but we need to also be responsible with our budget. So we ended up negotiating this bill. It increases the number of authorized visits for a PTSD exposure from 12 visits to 36 visits paid for by the employer. But it also says that those people have to be going to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist who's qualified in traumatic events. And so that really ups the standard for the treatment that they're getting. And instead of a year off, they can have up to 30 days off to decide if they want to go ahead and file a workers' comp claim, or if they want to come back and do light duty, or if they're ready to come back and do their regular jobs. And so it's much easier to, I think, administer, and it doesn't have the potential of abuse that a full year off with full pay and benefits would do. So this is one of those bills that, again, we felt like we needed to do something that was fair and fair to all sides, and so we agreed to do that. And it's in this slide, it's House Bill 2502 is the one that actually got through the process and was signed into law. All right, a couple other bills. Sober living homes. We had this issue come up a couple of years ago when there were some people buying up big homes in older neighborhoods, especially up in Prescott and that part of the world, and then just filling them with people who were substance abusers and sort of recovery without any standards. So we got the ability to have some very limited licensing at the local level, but that wasn't working very well because they could just move around from city to city. So what this bill does is it establishes a statewide licensing program for sober living homes after January 1st, 2019. This one has a delayed effective date. But once the Department of Health Services drafts rules to implement this law, then anybody that wants to go into the sober home business has to get a state license before they can operate in any community. So we think this is a good way to actually have a uniform standard throughout the entire state. This next bill, city clerks will be interested in, because this one, we were having some issues with people who were running, particularly in small communities, and way under the $1,100 spending threshold before they had to file a committee. So this lowers the spending threshold down to $500. So anything over $500, you have to file a campaign committee for a local office. Campaign fund transfers. This was a resolution that was brought by our vice president of the league, the mayor of Maricopa, because a couple of years ago the legislature said if you have leftover legislative funds in your campaign, you can use that to run for county supervisor or city council or town council, but you cannot use your local council funds to run for the legislature. We said that's not fair. Why? Let's level the playing field. So this would have simply said that you can also use local funds to run for a state legislative office. Unfortunately, it didn't pass. And we actually had somebody in the legislature come and tell us we don't like it when people who've been on city councils get elected to the legislature, because then they kind of know what we're doing down here, to your point. And so they're actually trying to keep you out of the legislature to be less friendly to cities.
I was going to ask on that. For the city clerk, when does that become effective on the 1,100 to 500?
That's August 3rd. Yeah. So, but I'm not sure that it applies to this election cycle, since you've already had your filing reports and stuff. But I know the clerks have had training on that already.
Yeah,
So.
I think that they're supposed to let it in writing.
Okay. Yeah. All right, and this next bill was a league resolution that allows streetlight improvement districts. If you have two of them that are contiguous and have the same rate, you can just merge them into one. It was a very simple bill. Special event liquor licenses. This allows city and town clerks to issue special event liquor licenses for like festivals and celebrations and you know, temporary events if authorized by the council. It also allows a city or town to actually receive the liquor license rather than having to find a nonprofit to partner with to do that. And it also, we were able to maintain a provision that had to do with acts of violence, which is sort of like enforcement in the parking lots of bars and restaurants and things. They were trying to make it so that fights and things did not actually constitute acts of violence, but we were able to preserve the current language so that you can still have some enforcement in outside of establishments that are serving liquor. Private school zoning. This the bill would have allowed private schools to locate anywhere they wanted without ever telling the city they were going to be establishing a school in that place. And we said, this is not a good idea. Charter schools got this authority a couple of years ago, and sometimes charter schools will pop up in strip malls and things like that, and all of a sudden people are dropping off their kids and you don't even know that there's a school there. We were able to work with the sponsor on this bill to amend it to say that we don't have to have property that's 1 acre or larger for a private school anymore. You can have it on 1 acre or smaller. But we got rid of that provision that said they don't have to talk to the city. They still have to go through the zoning process. Civil traffic violations. This next bill would have, as originally written, it would have voided a lot of traffic citations if there was one thing wrong. If you said it was on West Main Street and it was actually on Southwest Main Street, any technical error would have voided the traffic citation. And so we were able to work again with this sponsor and get it to say that the rules of civil procedure are still in place for traffic tickets, but it's still not this microscopic examination of every thing on the ticket to make it void or not. I don't think anybody down here uses GPLET, but Representative Leach has been very focused on GPLET. It's a tax provision that allows cities to do some economic development with tax abatements, and this was the only bill of the three that he introduced that was passed. I won't go into detail on that because I don't think you guys are using GPLET, are you?
No.
All right, bills that failed to pass. This was the first bill that was introduced, was to require everybody running for city office to declare a political party affiliation and put that on the ballot. We said, wait a minute, we don't want that. That's, again, why are you messing in our local business? We're nonpartisan. We don't want to operate in a partisan way, so fortunately that bill did not move forward. Statute of repose would have made the city liable for latent disease of a worker, a construction worker, years after a project if the city issued a license for it. This came from an individual who contracted mesothelioma because of an asbestos exposure years after the work was done, and the contractor said, well, I don't want to be responsible for paying for his disease. We got a city license for this project, so it should be the city's responsibility. We said, wait a minute, we have nothing to do with, we just issue the license to do the work. We don't have anything to do with the standards or what you're doing on the job. So fortunately that bill did not pass. The next bill would have dramatically hiked your PSPRS contributions by about 30%. It would have just statutorily assumed a rate of 4.7 instead of the current rate, which is 7.3.
Ken, what's the purpose of introducing something like that we're going to have to pay 30% more per employee? And where does it come, that kind of legislation come from?
Well, in this case, it was Senator Peterson from Gilbert who said he personally thinks that that PSPRS is too optimistic in their assumed rate of return, and he thinks it should be 4.7. So he said, as an elected representative, I get to determine that, and so he introduced this bill. Fortunately, the majority of his colleagues didn't agree to go along with him. And this next bill is an annual one. We get it every year that says that you have to ban photo radar everywhere. It's already banned at the state levels, banned on state highways. There's a few communities that still use it, and so this bill did not pass.
Ken, who's still using it? Who?
Phoenix is still using it, Scottsdale, Paradise Valley, mostly valley cities. The last town that was using it was outside of Payson. What am I thinking of? Star Valley had it, and the people considered that a speed trap, and so they banned it on state highways. That was on a state highway. So that's no longer enforced. But yeah, several valley cities do, and they use it. The three kinds. There's the speed radar, red light radar, and school zone radar. Disposition of public roadways. This bill did not pass. There was a series of bills that Representative Rivero introduced. This one would have said that if you have an alley that you're abandoning and it's adjacent to somebody's property, you can't sell it to them. You have to give it to them. And we said, that's not a good idea. That's city property. We should get fair market value for it. Municipal land acquisition. This would have undone a law that was passed for Marana last year that said if a county is going to buy up land inside a city for like a park or some other county use, you have to at least tell the city that they're buying land. And this would have undone that. Fortunately, it did not pass. And this next one, we called this the Yurt and Hogan bill because this would have allowed people to repeatedly subdivide their property and put mobile homes or yurts or hogans or temporary buildings on there and basically subdivide lots over and over and over again wherever they happen to be located. And we said that really messes up our whole land use system. Another bill that failed to pass, this was another GPLET bill that Mr. Leach introduced. This other bill would have lowered the requirement for selling land at an auction. Right now, it's $1.5 million valuation or more. You have to go out, do an appraisal, and sell it at auction. This would have lowered that down to $50,000. So that bill didn't pass. And this next one would have extended the time by 90 days for Prop 207 claims. Prop 207, as you know, is if the government does something that devalues your land, you can file a claim and get compensation for it. There was a guy in Flagstaff who filed a claim, waited 3 years and 90 days. So he comes to the legislature and says, I want you to add 90 days to the Prop 207 claim time, and fortunately that did not pass.
Ken,
Yes.
Before you go any further, on that one that failed of giving away cities and counties abandoned land, is that okay, so that you can't, you're not forced to do that. Is that what you're saying? Or if the city wants to do it anyway, they can do it?
You can do it, but this would have forced you, if you did that, to give it to the adjacent
you would have
property
been forced
owner.
to do it regardless.
Yeah,
We wouldn't have had a choice.
wouldn't have had a choice. Yeah, so you can choose to do that or choose to sell it, whatever, or just put a valuation on it or whatever. You can do that now. This next bill would have changed from strict compliance to, or moved from strict compliance to substantial compliance in filing notices of claims against government entities, so it would have made it easier to sue cities and towns. And these next two bills had to do with fire flow in rural areas. We had this one last year that would have said that you can build houses in an area where you have inadequate water to fire hydrants, and we didn't think that's a good idea, and this next one would have banned fire sprinklers even more than they are already banned. Public employee compensation cap, I said this one would have...
Can you say that they're already banned, the fire sprinklers? Isn't it by state that they anything over 10,000 square feet?
Well, in residential, they passed a preemption that says we cannot require it in residential homes. And this would have said if you didn't require it in all residential properties, then you couldn't have it. Even if you had it already in residential homes, you couldn't continue to have that requirement. This public employee cap, compensation cap, I said this would have terrorized football coaches because it would have limited the compensation of any public employee to no more than 2 times the salary and benefits of the governor. I think the governor makes about $100,000, so this would have capped the multi-million-dollar coaches' contracts to no more than $200,000. And this last one on this page would have basically extended, remember we had the chicken bill a couple of years ago? This would have basically extended the right of people to do agriculture, gardening, including beef, swine, fowl, and dairy, and livestock in your backyard. So, I mean, talk about violating the principles of zoning. This would have turned every property into a potential feedlot. This next one was one that we followed very closely because it was very high priority for MAG and PAG this last year, and that would have allowed the counties to submit to the voters up to a half-cent increase in sales tax to fund transportation projects. This was really important for Maricopa County because their Prop 400 is going to expire in 2022. They needed to get this back on the ballot, but this got tied up with a number of legislators who didn't want to have money going to light rail, and they were arguing over how much it should be and so forth. So ultimately this didn't go anywhere. I think it'll probably be back next year in a little narrower focus. This next bill would have essentially eliminated the category of spec builder. This is one that only cities use, so this would have been a very big financial hit to the cities and towns. And 2500 would have said that you can have, the realtors asked for this bill, it would have said that you can never regulate or limit the placement of real estate signs anywhere. And unfortunately, when the Reed case came out from the town of Gilbert a couple of years ago that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, it said you can't judge the content of a sign in terms of regulation. So if this bill had passed, it would have been unlimited signs for any purpose anywhere, not just real estate, because we can't make a distinction on signs based on their content. So fortunately, that bill did not pass. This next one was a little challenging for us because it looked good on the surface to some small towns. It would have redistributed $18 million of HERF funds from large cities and counties to small towns and counties. And Mr. Cook was very adamant about this. He's from Globe, and he said we have great needs in Globe, and we said everybody has great needs. It's not a matter of the distribution formula, it's a matter of the funds altogether. And as I mentioned, that HERF gets swept every year. So I said we need to increase the size of the pie, not worry about the redistribution of the pie. Fortunately, this bill did not move forward because if you could change the distribution formula one year, then you can change shared revenue in the future. It really opens the door. It's the slippery slope argument that if you can change a formula one year for one purpose, you can change it another year for a whole different purpose, and we didn't even want to go there. This next one would have required all police and fire departments to have one standard for reporting response times and then to post those response times on your website. That did not pass. And this other bill about municipal seals would have restricted any city, town logo. You could only use it for public purposes. You couldn't do it for city, like local celebrations or in partnering with any company or offering any other service other than just public governmental services. Other bills of interest, ASRS non-participating employer. This one was passed and signed into law. And this one says that if somebody leaves the ASRS system, they have to pay their accumulated liability. This is really focused on ASU because for several years ASU has said that they're thinking about leaving the state retirement system and just going out on their own. That would leave a huge hole with all the members that they have and their contributions, and it would raise all of our contribution rates. So this says even if you leave, you still have to make your contribution. And so I think this kind of chills the idea of them going out for a separate retirement plan. Photo radar review, this one was passed. It simply requires a peace officer to review every photo radar ticket before it's issued, so the private company that takes the picture can't do that. And this last bill on this page, online lodging. This is a good bill because it levels the playing field with Airbnb and every other online marketplace that does short-term rentals. When we negotiated the original bill, it was Airbnb that was at the table, and they said, okay, we will pay local tax for any residential rentals that are used on our platform, but VRBO and HomeAway and all the others didn't have to remit local tax. This says anybody that's using online marketplaces to sell short-term rentals has to pay local tax and state tax on those transactions. This next bill is interesting. I think it's probably going to be way off in the future. It's like a Jetsons bill. This says that you can have delivery robots up to 200 pounds with a speed of 7 miles an hour on your city streets and sidewalks. So if you see a robot going down the street delivering a package, it's legal now. I haven't seen And then this bill 2065, your city attorney should take a look at this because this codifies several attorney general opinions regarding the open meeting law, and it really tightens things up and says you can't have public funds, you can't have the city defend you if you're accused, you're individually liable. You know, I've been out here and talked about this provision before with you all, but it also tightens up the ability to do one-way communication on electronic platforms. So if you have a Facebook page or Twitter and you're proposing action and it's going to a majority of the council, a quorum of the council, then you could be in violation of the open meeting law. So you really need to be careful about how you use that kind of online communication if you're proposing some sort of action or if you're talking about something that's going to be on a council agenda.
So can, after the 3rd, when we have a meeting after the 3rd, it's no longer proper to say all those in favor say aye, all those opposed say no. We have to have like a roll call vote for everything.
That is correct. You're absolutely correct. That's one of the other provisions of this bill is it has to be an individual recorded vote on every question before the council.
But let's say if you have a unanimous vote.
Then you just check the box that everybody voted yes, you know.
So it doesn't have to be a roll call.
It doesn't have to be a roll call.
Only if you hear
you just
a nay.
have to record the vote of every member individually.
Okay, yeah, but then we would be taking 2 votes because if somebody's against it, then it's not unanimous. Then we have to have a roll call.
A roll call, right? Yeah, but if everybody says aye and there's no nays, then it's recorded that everybody voted in favor.
Would that be correct, or is the intent that the vote of each person is recorded how they voted?
Well, if it's
I don't know.
unanimous,
I'd check with the city attorney on procedure that you're asking about. It seems to me that if you that if you say that everybody says aye, then you could just simply say that every member voted that way unless somebody was absent.
Because the Arizona School Boards Association issued an opinion that said you have to take a roll call vote practically
On every question.
everything you do.
Yeah.
and Seagulls said otherwise. They said if it's the majority, then it's recorded as everybody individually voting in favor.
Yeah. That seems, I mean, just procedurally, that seems like a more efficient way to do it. But again, I'm not. You need to check with your own attorney and get some advice on that. This next bill basically raises the rates on EORP. Is anybody left in EORP? Very few cities were even in EORP. That's the Elected Officials Retirement Plan. It raises the rates because they closed that plan, so it increases the contribution rate. Community Facilities District, this fixes a technical problem that we had in the bill last year. It didn't change Community Facilities Districts, how they're structured or any of their uses. And this last one, pension funding policy requirement, every city and town is now required to adopt a pension funding policy. You just have to simply say what your plan is for paying down your unfunded liability. And we have a link on our website under resources that has a form that you can just download, print out, and then bring that before the council for action, and that'll take care of this requirement for pension funding policy. Police fire definition of day. There was some issue when some police and fire personnel went off to do military duty, and they were saying they're going to be gone for so many days. The question is, well, what is a day? And this bill simply defines a day as whatever your normal shift is. If it's 8 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, that's what a day is as far as military service is concerned. Prime contracting study. Representative Cobb from Kingman continues to want to change the way we do construction sales tax and just go to a point of purchase retail tax on materials only. She got $75,000 to do a study on non-compliance to make her case for that. Local food and soda tax. This says that we cannot have a discriminatory tax for sugary drinks. So like some cities back east were, having a Coca-Cola tax or a Pepsi tax or whatever, you can't do that. If you have food for home consumption and in your tax code, then you have to charge the same rate to all food items. And then consolidated elections, keep talking about the legislature meddling in charter cities and then elections. This says that if you have not yet gone to a consolidated fall election day, then you have to determine whether you had a decrease of 25% or more in voter turnout, and if so, then you have to go to the consolidated election day. So again, it's one of those things that the Supreme Court has ruled several times that local elections are a city matter, but they still passed this bill to say that provision will go into effect, and I'm sure somebody will probably sue over that. All right, what can we look forward to next session? Well, as you know, we're in election season, and all 90 legislators are up, and all the statewide offices are up, so it's going to be very interesting to see who turns out the vote this cycle. You know, we've had a lot of people that said because of education, because of the blue wave, we're going to see big changes. I'm skeptical. I've heard that many, many times. I kind of don't think we're going to see a whole lot of change, but you never know. Things could be very different, or they could be very much the same. We know we will have new leadership in both the Senate and the House because the President and the Speaker both have left their respective positions. The Speaker's trying to move over to the Senate, and the Senate President retired from the legislature. We don't know what the vote impact will be of these voter initiatives that are on the ballot. You know, the education funding, the mandate for renewable energy. Who is that going to bring out certain voters and bring out other voters? Budget sustainability. I mentioned this regarding the teacher issue. You know, one of the big ways that they sold the teacher pay was that, well, the economy's doing well, tax collections are up, but there's a lot of people that say as soon as tax collections go up, then we need to cut taxes so we don't increase them. And they've made a lot of commitments going into the future, and where's that money going to come from? Of course, 1487 claims are always a challenge. Like I said, we just had one last week. And the influence of anti-government groups. I mentioned the Goldwater Institute earlier. We also have the Institute for Justice, Americans for Prosperity, and the Free Enterprise Club. And those groups really work very closely together and are coming after us on a lot of things like the home-based business and some of those other issues. And so they're really proving to be formidable opponents. All right, we have our league policy committees. They have met several times. We have a compressed meeting cycle for them between May and July, and you'll see the results of their work at the league conference at the resolutions committee. And I encourage you next year, if you're interested in being part of the policy making process, to go ahead and get involved. It's open to any city and town official, elected or appointed, and so we encourage you to participate in those policy committees. And then always we like you to look at the league website, use our tools and our trainings and so forth, and look forward to seeing you all at the league conference in August. And if you can, participate on our Monday legislative calls and track our bills. All the bills that we work on during the session are available in legislative bill monitoring, and then we also do the weekly bulletin and alerts as things pop up. And all of the laws that I talked about that were passed and many, many more are also summarized in the new laws report, which is on the website, and you can access that. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any more questions. I think I got done pretty close to the hour.
That was great. Thank you, Ken.
What do you see in the future for this next legislative session?
Well, like I'm saying, it'll all depend on what the makeup is and who the leadership is. You know, the governor, very likely, it's very hard for an incumbent governor with the money that they have to not be reelected. So we'll probably have Governor Ducey back again. But as far as legislative leadership and what the makeup is, that'll be very interesting. We've actually heard a couple of people say that they think the Senate might even go to a 15-15 tie. It'll only take two districts to go from Republican to Democrat to go to a 15-15, and if that happens, that would be a very, very different dynamic at the legislature. But like I said, I've heard those predictions before. They never seem to happen, and so we'll just see what the turnout is.
Okay. Thank you, Ken. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, everybody.
All right, Ken, thank you.
See you in August.
So August 21st, 24th, where is that going to be at? What
At the Phoenician.
Well, we're
Oh,
going
that's right, that's
we're
right.
going to be at the Camel.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Okay, yeah, I forgot about that.
And thank you for having all the water and drinks, soft drinks, cookies. It was very good. Thank you.
Okay.
That didn't take
Thanks
much of
again,
your-
Ken. I got to run, so
Not even
thank
us.
you.
Bueno, galletitas. No hay sandwichitos, pero hay galletitas. ¿Verdad?
How are you, Mr. Doug?
I couldn't hear you very well. Sorry.
Hey, thanks for coming.
Oh, it's because sometimes I get my phone and I do this. It's just a habit, and that's what. And I always hear people talk. I can't hear you.
sorry.
That's what happens.
What's happening to the railroad with the WB market? Are they?
I've been in contact with them, and they keep basically just saying that they're trying to finalize the contract, and then the contractor should be out.
How's it going, Dr. Felix?
At the end of the
It's
month.
going.
And they keep
Well, they said
moving.
the end
bien?
of July they'll pull a permit.
Que cabe.
Oh,
So we're still just kind of waiting. We got a few days left, so I've been on them. I've been sending them
That's
emails all
right.
throughout the month. Just saying,
Yeah, because they really stretched it
You
out.
gotta take it slow and don't let it
well,
go.
what happened was apparently, I don't know if you got copied on this email, but apparently they were looking for a contractor, and then there's some issue with their procurement, and so they had to go out to bid for another contractor, and then they finally got another contractor secured for it. They got their hazmat done. That's all fine and dandy, and now I guess they're ready to pull a demo permit. So they said they're just waiting to finalize that and get a demo permit. But the last thing I said to them essentially was, my department issues the demo permits, and I haven't seen anything. So what are you guys doing? You dragging your heels or what?
what about the property over here from?
Same issue. So right now we're actually doing an assessment on the total cost of what it would cost to get involved with that. We're doing our cost benefit analysis.
Thank you, Ken. Nice seeing you.
You don't want to hear the debate on the mayor's tonight?
Thank you.
I think I'll pass on that one.
Yeah, you've seen enough of that. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you. Have a good trip
So we're just
back.
finding out there might be some equipment rental involved, and then we're also just